Most people remember Isaiah as the prophet who spoke of a child called Immanuel, a coming Prince of Peace, a suffering servant, and a future world in which swords would be beaten into plowshares. Those words have echoed for centuries. They appear in churches at Christmas. They are read during Holy Week. They are quoted whenever Christians speak about the Messiah, salvation, judgment, or hope. But that is not where Isaiah's story begins. It begins with a nation that believed it was secure. Judah still had a king descended from David. Jerusalem still stood. The temple still dominated the sacred landscape of the capital. Priests still offered sacrifices. Festivals were still observed. Prayers were still spoken. From the outside, the kingdom possessed many of the things that seemed to prove God's favor. But Isaiah saw something different. He saw a society where worship continued while justice was collapsing. He saw religious activity without faithful obedience. He saw rulers making decisions out of fear. He saw wealth existing beside exploitation. And beyond the borders of Judah, he saw something even more terrifying. An empire was rising. Assyria was becoming the dominant military power of the ancient Near East, expanding through intimidation, conquest, tribute, deportation, and overwhelming force. Within a generation, kingdoms would disappear. Cities would burn. The northern kingdom of Israel would fall. And eventually the armies of Assyria would come so close to Jerusalem that the survival of Judah itself would appear impossible. Isaiah's famous prophecies were not spoken in a peaceful classroom. They were spoken in the shadow of national disaster. And this is the part of his story that is often overlooked. Isaiah was not simply a man standing outside history, predicting events hundreds of years away. He was a prophet, standing inside a collapsing political world, confronting kings who were terrified of the future and a people who were often more willing to trust armies, alliances, wealth, and ritual than the God they claimed to worship. To understand Isaiah, we have to return to that world, and we have to begin with a king whose death marked the end of an era. The book introduces the prophet simply as Isaiah, son of Amoz. His visions concern Judah and Jerusalem during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That short introduction places Isaiah's ministry across decades of enormous change. When his prophetic world opens, Judah is not yet a ruined nation. In fact, the reign of Uzziah had been associated with considerable strength. According to Chronicles, Uzziah strengthened Jerusalem, maintained military forces, developed agricultural interests, and expanded Judah's influence. His reign was long, and for many people living in Jerusalem, he would have represented stability. A generation could grow up knowing no other king. Borders could change, enemies could rise and fall, children could become adults, yet Uzziah remained on the throne. But political strength is never the full story in Scripture. Chronicles also remembers the king's pride. After becoming powerful, Uzziah entered the temple and attempted to burn incense, a priestly act that was not his to perform. Priests confronted him, and the king became angry. Then his story changed. He was struck with a skin disease and lived in isolation while his son Jotham governed the royal household and the people. The man who had represented national strength finished his reign separated from the temple and removed from ordinary royal life. Then Uzziah died. Isaiah dates one of the most important experiences of his life to that exact moment. In the year that King Uzziah died, the king was gone, but Isaiah saw another throne. He saw the Lord high and exalted. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim calling to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The foundations shook. Smoke filled the house. And Isaiah did not respond like a man who had just been given an inspiring religious experience. He responded like a man who suddenly understood how dangerous holiness was. "Woe is me!" That cry matters. Before Isaiah announced woe over kingdoms, cities, rulers, and nations, he experienced it personally. Before he spoke about the corruption of Judah, he saw his own condition. "I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips." Isaiah did not place himself safely above the people he would confront. The prophet belonged to the same world of human uncleanness, and yet his eyes had seen the King. That word king becomes even more powerful when we remember the date of the vision. Uzziah was dead. Judah had lost its earthly king. Isaiah saw that the true throne had never been empty. The contrast is difficult to miss. Human rulers rise and fall. Their reigns end. Their strength disappears. Their monuments become ruins. But the Lord Isaiah saw was not scrambling to respond to political uncertainty. He was enthroned. That vision becomes one of the keys to the entire book. Isaiah will spend decades speaking to people who are frightened by human power. They will fear Syria. They will fear the northern kingdom of Israel. They will fear Assyria. Some will later look toward Egypt. Babylon will eventually appear on the horizon. Again and again, rulers will face the temptation to believe that the greatest reality in their world is the army currently marching across the map. Isaiah's calling begins by showing him a greater reality. The Lord is king. But that does not mean Judah is safe from consequences. The same holiness that gives Isaiah confidence also exposes Judah's sin. One of the most important truths in Isaiah is that covenant privilege does not cancel accountability. Jerusalem had the temple. Judah had the Davidic dynasty. The people had inherited sacred traditions, but Isaiah's opening message sounds less like congratulations and more like a courtroom accusation. The nation has rebelled. The people have turned away. The language is severe. Isaiah compares Judah to a body covered with wounds. The land has experienced devastation. Cities have suffered. And yet the people continue bringing offerings. They continue gathering for worship. They continue stretching out their hands in prayer. The problem is not that worship exists. The problem is that worship has been separated from the kind of life the covenant demanded. Isaiah attacks that contradiction. Religious ceremony has become intolerable when hands are associated with bloodshed and society ignores justice. The prophet calls the people to watch themselves, turn from evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, and plead for the widow. This is one of the overlooked foundations of Isaiah's message. The book is not primarily a collection of mysterious predictions waiting to be decoded by later generations. It begins by asking whether a people who claim to belong to God will actually live as though His holiness matters. Isaiah's God is not impressed by religious performance that protects injustice, and judgment is not presented as divine unpredictability. It has a moral context. The people have been warned. The covenant has been violated. Power has been abused. Trust has been misplaced. Yet even here, judgment is not the only word. Isaiah's opening chapters already contain something that will become one of the great tensions of the book. Judgment and hope stand beside each other. Jerusalem can be condemned for corruption, yet Isaiah can also envision a future Zion, toward which nations stream to learn the ways of the Lord. Weapons become tools of cultivation. War gives way to peace. The city that presently fails to embody justice is imagined as a center from which God's instruction goes out to the nations. This pattern will repeat throughout Isaiah. A tree may be cut down, a stump remains. A city may be judged, a remnant survives. A kingdom may fail, a promise continues. But the path from judgment to restoration will not be simple. Isaiah has first been called to speak to people who may refuse to hear him. Inside the temple vision, one of the seraphim flies toward him, carrying a burning coal taken from the altar. The coal touches Isaiah's lips. The place Isaiah had identified as unclean becomes the place touched by purification. His guilt is removed, his sin is atoned for. Then the scene changes. Isaiah hears the voice of the Lord. "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And Isaiah answers, "Here am I, send me." Those words are often remembered as an uncomplicated moment of courageous surrender. But what follows makes the calling far more unsettling. Isaiah is commissioned to a people whose hearing and understanding are already spiritually damaged. His preaching will not immediately produce a national revival. Instead, the language of the commission speaks of hardened perception, hearing without truly hearing, seeing without truly understanding. Isaiah asks the obvious question, how long? The answer is devastating. Until cities lie waste, until houses stand empty, until the land is desolate, until people are removed. This is not the career announcement a young prophet would invent for himself. Isaiah is being sent to speak truth in a society moving toward catastrophe. His success cannot simply be measured by whether everyone listens. He must speak because the message is true even when the audience resists it. And yet once again, the final image is not absolute annihilation. After the image of a tree being felled, something remains. A stump. A holy seed. The language is brief, but the idea will become enormous. Judgment may strip away what appears permanent, but God is not finished. This theme of a surviving remnant will become so important that Isaiah's own family will carry it. One of his sons will bear the name Shir-Yashub, a remnant shall return. In Isaiah's world, even children's names can become prophetic signs. But before those signs can be understood, we have to see the world changing around the prophet. After Uzziah, Jotham ruled Judah. The biblical record presents him more positively than many kings, yet the deeper corruption of the people did not simply disappear. Then came Ahaz, and with Ahaz, the political pressure surrounding Judah became far more dangerous. To the north stood the kingdom of Israel, sometimes called Ephraim in prophetic texts. Beside it stood Aram, centered in Damascus. Far beyond them, Assyria was expanding under ambitious rulers who were turning the region into an imperial system. Small kingdoms faced terrible choices: submit, pay tribute, form alliances, rebel, or be destroyed. This was not theoretical politics. When an Assyrian army arrived, entire cities could lose their independence. Populations could be deported. Kings could be replaced. Local economies could be absorbed into imperial demands. The map Isaiah knew was being rewritten, and soon Judah would be forced into one of the most important decisions in its history. Israel and Aram formed an anti-Assyrian coalition. They wanted Judah involved. Ahaz refused, so the two kingdoms turned against him. Their intention, according to Isaiah, was not merely to frighten Judah, but to invade it, break its resistance, and replace its king. This meant the crisis was more than military. The dynasty of David itself appeared threatened. Jerusalem heard the news. The reaction is described with one of the most vivid images in Isaiah. The heart of Ahaz and the hearts of his people shook as trees of the forest shake in the wind. Fear had entered the palace. This is where Isaiah's theology becomes inseparable from political history. Ahaz needed to decide where security came from. He could look at armies. He could calculate alliances. He could assess military strength. He could seek help from a greater empire. Or he could trust the promise that Isaiah declared. The choice would shape far more than one battle. Isaiah went to meet the king, and he did not go alone. With him was his son Shir-Jashub. A remnant shall return. Before Isaiah even spoke, the child beside him carried a message. The prophet told Ahaz not to panic. The two kings threatening Jerusalem appeared dangerous, but Isaiah described them as smoldering stubs of firebrands. Their plan would not stand. Then came the warning at the center of the confrontation. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. Trust was not an abstract spiritual subject. It had become a national decision. Would Ahaz believe that Judah's future depended ultimately on the faithfulness of God? Or would he decide that survival required placing Judah under the protection of something more visible, something with soldiers, something with horses, something with siege engines, something like Assyria? The Lord offered Ahaz a sign. The king could ask for something profound, whether in the depths or the heights. But Ahaz refused. His words sounded humble. I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. Yet the surrounding story makes the refusal far more complicated than simple reverence. The king had already formed his own political instincts about survival. Isaiah responded with frustration. And then came one of the most famous signs in the entire book. Immanuel, God with us. For generations, readers would return to these words. Matthew would later quote Isaiah when telling the story of Jesus. But before we move centuries forward, we have to understand why the sign mattered in the first place. It was spoken to the house of David during a crisis threatening the house of David. It emerged when enemies were trying to remove Judah's king. It came when fear had convinced Ahaz that visible political power might be more trustworthy than the word of God. Whatever questions later readers ask about the full horizon of the prophecy, the sign first entered history here, Jerusalem afraid. The Davidic dynasty threatened, a king refusing the offered sign, and Assyria waiting in the background. Because Ahaz would not simply face the two kingdoms already attacking him, he would turn toward a third power, a far greater one. According to Kings and Chronicles, Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. He appealed for rescue. He took silver and gold from the temple and palace treasuries and sent them as payment. From the viewpoint of immediate political calculation, the decision could appear brilliant. Assyria was stronger than Aram, stronger than Israel, stronger than Judah. If a small kingdom could not defeat its enemies, why not purchase the protection of the greatest empire in the region? Assyria responded. Damascus would eventually fall. The pressure on Ahaz would change, but Isaiah saw the hidden cost. The instrument Ahaz trusted for salvation would not remain a distant protector. Assyria would become the flood that overflowed the region. The empire invited to solve Judah's crisis would advance until its waters reached toward Judah itself. And before this chapter of history was finished, the northern kingdom of Israel would vanish beneath that imperial expansion. Cities that had stood for generations would fall. Families would be displaced. The political landscape of the people of Israel would be permanently altered. And Jerusalem would discover that there is a dangerous difference between being rescued by an empire and becoming dependent upon one. Isaiah's story had moved from the smoke-filled temple to the war rooms of frightened kings. The question had changed in form, but not in substance. Who truly sits on the throne? Who will Judah trust? And what happens when a nation looks to the very power that will one day stand at its gates? The answer was already marching toward them. Assyria had answered Ahaz. But Assyria never rescued small kingdoms for free. To understand what Isaiah was warning about, we have to step outside Jerusalem for a moment and look at the larger world surrounding Judah. The kingdoms mentioned in Isaiah were not isolated names on an ancient map. They were competing for survival in a region being transformed by imperial expansion. To the northeast stood Assyria, whose rulers had developed one of the most formidable military systems of the ancient Near East. Its armies could cross enormous distances. Its engineers could attack fortified cities. Its kings demanded tribute from conquered territories, and when rebellion continued, Assyria could remove populations from their homes and resettle them elsewhere within the empire. This was not destruction for destruction's sake alone. Deportation could weaken local identity, break political resistance, and reorganize conquered lands under imperial control. The strategy was effective. Kingdom after kingdom learned the same lesson. You could pay Assyria, you could serve Assyria, you could attempt to rebel against Assyria. But ignoring Assyria was becoming impossible. During the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyrian expansion accelerated dramatically. The empire moved westward toward the Mediterranean and southward into the political world surrounding Israel and Judah. For rulers like Ahaz, every diplomatic decision now carried enormous consequences. A small kingdom might survive one enemy by becoming dependent upon another. And that is exactly what happened. The coalition formed by Rezin of Aram and Pekah of Israel had placed Ahaz under intense pressure. Aram was centered in Damascus. Israel, the northern kingdom, was Judah's close relative by ancestry, but often its political rival. Both kingdoms feared Assyrian domination. They wanted Judah to join resistance against the empire. Ahaz refused. From the perspective of Rezin and Pekah, Judah's refusal threatened their coalition. So they moved against Jerusalem. Isaiah describes their plan bluntly. They intended to invade Judah, terrify it, divide its territory, and install another ruler. The phrase Isaiah uses for that proposed ruler, the son of Tabeel, is almost all Scripture tells us about him. That absence of information is important. We should not invent a detailed biography where the text gives none. What matters is what the plan represented. The house of David was under threat. For generations, Judah's kings had descended from David. Now foreign enemies were considering replacing the Davidic king with someone of their choosing. This gives Isaiah 7 its extraordinary tension. The issue was not merely whether one city could survive a siege. The question touched the dynasty that had carried God's covenant promise since the days of David. Ahaz saw armies. Isaiah saw a crisis of trust. That difference explains why the prophet's language often seems to move between politics and theology without warning. For Isaiah, they were not separate. What a king believed about God would eventually shape what he did with ambassadors' money, armies, alliances, and foreign powers. Faith had political consequences. Fear had political consequences. And the decision Ahaz made would reach far beyond his own reign. When Isaiah met him, Ahaz was near the conduit of the upper pool, apparently concerned with Jerusalem's water system, as the city prepared for possible attack. It is a revealing setting. A king responsible for defending his capital was examining practical preparations. There was nothing inherently wrong with preparing the city's resources. Isaiah was not demanding irresponsibility. The deeper question was what Ahaz believed would ultimately preserve Judah. That is why Isaiah's message was so direct. Do not fear these two kings. Their plan will not succeed. Stand firm in faith. And then came the offer of a sign. Ahaz could ask. He refused. The refusal sounded pious, but the wider biblical picture shows a ruler who was hardly defined by extraordinary confidence in the Lord. 2 Kings and Chronicles describe a reign marked by religious compromise and dependence upon foreign power. Ahaz's problem was not excessive reverence. He already knew where he wanted to look for security: Assyria. And so the sign was announced anyway. A young woman would conceive and bear a son, and his name would be called Immanuel, God with us. Few passages in Isaiah have generated more discussion. Christian readers know immediately that Matthew later applies Isaiah's words to the birth of Jesus. That New Testament connection matters, and we will return to it. But Isaiah's original audience did not live in 1st century Bethlehem. They lived in 8th century Judah. Rezin and Pekah were threatening Jerusalem now. Ahaz was afraid now. The house of David was facing a political crisis now. And Isaiah's prophecy contained a near historical horizon. Before the child reached a stage of maturity described by the prophet, the lands of the two kings Ahaz feared would be devastated. That is essential. The prophecy had meaning for the king standing in front of Isaiah, but it also entered the book of Isaiah as part of a larger pattern of expectation, one that would continue developing through the chapters ahead. The mistake is to force ourselves into only one direction. We should not erase the 8th century crisis simply because Matthew later sees fulfillment in Jesus. And we should not erase Matthew's interpretation simply because Isaiah's words had an immediate historical setting. The biblical story itself invites us to follow both horizons carefully. For Ahaz, however, the immediate issue was about to become brutally concrete. He had appealed to Tiglath-Pileser. Assyria acted. Aram came under attack. Damascus fell. Rezin was killed. The kingdom that had helped terrify Ahaz was broken. From the palace in Jerusalem, the strategy might have looked successful. The enemy had been defeated. The stronger ally had intervened. The crisis had changed. But Isaiah had already warned that Assyria would bring consequences of its own. This is one of the great ironies of the story. Ahaz feared two smaller powers and sought shelter beneath a greater one. But the greater power did not become Judah's friend. It became Judah's master. 2 Kings records Ahaz sending silver and gold from the temple and royal treasury to the Assyrian king. Tribute bought intervention. But tribute also acknowledged dependence. Judah had moved deeper into Assyria's imperial orbit. The cost was not merely financial. After traveling to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, Ahaz saw an altar there and ordered a copy constructed in Jerusalem. The biblical account describes changes to the temple arrangements under his reign. Foreign political submission and religious accommodation began to appear beside each other. The king who had refused God's sign was becoming increasingly shaped by the empire he trusted. Isaiah saw the danger in imagery that his audience could understand immediately. Assyria would be like a river overflowing its banks. The Euphrates was associated with the great power to the northeast. A controlled river could sustain life. An overflowing river could destroy everything in its path. Isaiah pictured the waters rising through the region, sweeping through Judah, reaching even to the neck. The image is terrifying. Ahaz had invited the flood. And yet in the middle of that warning, Isaiah again uses the language of Immanuel. The land belongs, in some sense, under the sign of God with us. This is what makes these chapters so dense. Judgment and promise are woven together. Assyria advances, enemies fall, Judah is threatened, children carry prophetic names, the Davidic house is tested, and the question of God's presence hangs over every political calculation. Isaiah's own family became part of the message. The prophet was instructed to give another son an extraordinary name, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. The name points towards speed. The spoil hastens the plunder, comes quickly. Before the child was old enough to speak familiar family words, Isaiah declared that the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria would be carried away before the king of Assyria. Again, prophecy was not floating above history. A child growing in Isaiah's household became a living clock. Every ordinary stage of development moved the audience closer to political catastrophe. Imagine the effect. Isaiah walks through Jerusalem with one son named "A Remnant Shall Return." Another carries a name announcing rapidly approaching plunder. His family itself has become part of the prophetic confrontation. Hope, judgment, survival, disaster. All of them walking through the same streets. But the northern kingdom was in much greater danger than Judah yet understood. Israel had already experienced serious instability before its final fall. Kings rose and disappeared. Assassinations and political upheaval weakened the monarchy. Territory was lost. Assyrian pressure increased. The nation once ruled by the house of Omri and later by Jehu's dynasty was entering its final decades. Isaiah often refers to the northern kingdom as Ephraim, using the name of one of its dominant tribes. To Judah, Ephraim could appear both familiar and foreign. They shared ancestral roots. They also had separate kings, separate political histories, and a long record of rivalry. Now Isaiah watched the northern kingdom move toward destruction. This mattered deeply for Judah. Israel's collapse would not simply remove a neighboring state. It would demonstrate that belonging to the covenant people did not make a kingdom immune to judgment. The northern kingdom had its history, its prophets, its worship traditions, its memories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, its claim to belong to Israel. But none of that prevented catastrophe when rebellion became entrenched. Isaiah was not the only prophet warning during this age. Hosea spoke powerfully to the northern kingdom. Micah, associated with Judah, also condemned corruption and injustice. The prophetic witness differed in voice and emphasis, but the message converged on a disturbing reality. Religious identity without covenant faithfulness could not protect a nation from consequences. For years, Israel maneuvered beneath Assyrian pressure. Eventually, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, fell. 2 Kings describes the final collapse during the Assyrian campaigns associated with Shalmaneser V, and the imperial power continued under Sargon II. The biblical text emphasizes the theological reasons for Israel's fall: persistent idolatry, rejection of warnings, covenant unfaithfulness, and refusal to turn back despite prophetic appeals. At the historical level, Assyria conquered the kingdom. At the theological level, Kings insists that the collapse cannot be understood merely as one empire defeating a weaker state. The fall was also judgment. Those two levels do not have to compete. An Assyrian army moved through history. Israel's choices had moral meaning. One event could be both geopolitical and theological within the biblical interpretation of history. Samaria fell. People were deported. Other populations were later resettled in portions of the conquered territory. The political entity known as the Northern Kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. Think about what that meant for someone living in Judah. For generations, the divided monarchy had been a basic fact of life. There was Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Two kingdoms descended from the nation once ruled by David and Solomon. Now one was gone. Not weakened, not temporarily occupied. Gone as an independent monarchy. Assyria had swallowed it. The warning Judah needed was now visible on the map. Isaiah no longer had to describe imperial danger only through metaphor. People could look north. They could hear reports from conquered cities. They could encounter refugees and displaced families. They could watch the Assyrian frontier move closer. The flood was real. Yet Isaiah refused to let fear become the controlling interpretation of history. This is where another famous set of images emerges. The territories of Zebulun and Naphtali regions in the north, heavily affected by foreign invasion, become part of a future vision. Land associated with humiliation would one day see honor. People walking in darkness would see a great light. The language moves from military oppression toward liberation. A yoke is broken. A rod of oppression is shattered. War equipment disappears into fire. And then Isaiah introduces a child. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Government rests upon his shoulders. His reign is associated with justice, righteousness, peace, and the throne of David. This is not the picture of Ahaz. The contrast is striking. Ahaz had faced fear and trusted imperial calculation. Isaiah looks toward a ruler whose government would embody the qualities the present monarchy lacked. The book is beginning to develop a question larger than the survival of one king. What would faithful Davidic kingship actually look like? How could the promise attached to David survive rulers who repeatedly failed? Isaiah does not answer every part of that question at once. Instead, the images accumulate. Immanuel, a child, a son, a Davidic ruler, justice, peace, a remnant, light after darkness. The pieces are being placed on the board. But before the promised future could fully emerge, Judah would have to survive the present. And survival was not guaranteed. After the fall of the northern kingdom, Assyria remained dominant. Judah had been spared the fate of Samaria, but it had not escaped the empire. Ahaz died. His son Hezekiah came to the throne. The biblical account presents Hezekiah very differently. 2 Kings remembers him as a king who trusted the Lord and carried out significant religious reforms. He removed high places, broke sacred pillars, cut down the Asherah, and even destroyed the bronze serpent associated with Moses because people had begun burning incense to it. Hezekiah appears as a reformer, a king attempting to turn Judah away from patterns tolerated or encouraged under previous reigns. But reform did not make international politics disappear. Assyria still existed. Tribute still mattered. Imperial authority still cast its shadow over Judah. And eventually, Hezekiah would do something extraordinarily dangerous. He would rebel. From a political perspective, resistance to Assyria could appear possible when imperial leadership changed, distant regions revolted, or neighboring kingdoms sought alliances. Small states often watched carefully for moments when a great empire seemed vulnerable. But rebellion carried enormous risk. If Assyria recovered its strength, punishment could be devastating. Hezekiah would soon discover this. For Isaiah, the coming crisis would revive the central question of Ahaz's reign, but at a much greater scale. Where will Judah place its trust? Some leaders would look toward Egypt. Others would calculate military defenses. Fortifications would matter, water supplies would matter, diplomacy would matter. But Isaiah would insist that none of these could substitute for faithfulness to God. This did not make Isaiah politically naive. His prophecies show a striking awareness of nations' alliances, military movement, and imperial ambition. What he rejected was the belief that political technique could save a nation while its deeper rebellion remained untouched. Judah could repair walls while neglecting justice. It could secure water while ignoring the God who gave the city life. It could send ambassadors while refusing prophetic warning. A nation could become strategically clever and spiritually blind at the same time. That was the danger, and Assyria was coming. Under Sennacherib, the empire would launch a campaign that devastated Judah. Fortified cities would fall. Jerusalem would become isolated. Assyrian officials would stand close enough to its walls to speak directly to the people defending them. They would mock Hezekiah. They would challenge his alliances. And they would ask a question designed to destroy confidence. What are you trusting in? It was almost as if Assyria itself had learned the central vocabulary of Isaiah. Trust. That had been the question for Ahaz. It would now become the question for Hezekiah. But this time, the enemy would not remain somewhere beyond the horizon. The army Judah once invited into the region would stand at Jerusalem's door, and the city would have to discover whether the lesson Ahaz failed to learn could still be learned before it was too late. By the time Hezekiah inherited the throne, Isaiah had already watched one king choose fear over trust, one neighboring kingdom collapse, and Assyria transform from a distant superpower into the dominant force of the region. But Isaiah had also been building something else, a language of signs, a language of names, a language of remnants, children, roads, rivers, stumps, and surviving seeds. These details are easy to pass over because they do not always look dramatic at first. There are no armies charging across the page when Isaiah names his son. No palace falls when a child is born. No city burns when the prophet speaks of a stump. Yet these quiet images carry some of the most important ideas in the entire book. Isaiah's message was not simply that destruction was coming. It was that destruction would not erase the promise. That difference is everything. His first son had already carried the name Shir-Yashub, a remnant shall return. At first, the name could sound comforting. Something will survive. Someone will come back. But the word remnant carries a darker implication as well. If only a remnant returns, then much has been lost. The name does not deny judgment. It assumes it. Isaiah's hope is not the optimism of someone who thinks nothing terrible will happen. It is the hope of someone who believes terrible things can happen without giving those things the final word. This becomes one of the defining patterns of Isaiah. A forest can be cut down, a stump remains. A nation can be shaken, a remnant survives. Jerusalem can be threatened, the promise can continue. But Isaiah's second son carries a very different tone. Maher Shalal Hashbaz, a name sounding like an alarm. The spoil speeds, the plunder hastens. The boy's life becomes tied to the countdown toward disaster for Damascus and Samaria. Isaiah even has the name written publicly before the child's birth, turning the message into a visible sign. This was prophecy entering ordinary life. People in Jerusalem could debate Isaiah's words. They could ignore a sermon. They could dismiss a warning. But every time Isaiah called his child by name, the warning returned. Judgment is coming quickly. The prophet's household had become a living message. Isaiah later says that he and the children the Lord had given him were signs and portents in Israel. That sentence reveals something about the cost of prophetic ministry. Isaiah did not simply deliver messages and then return to a private life untouched by them. His family carried them. His children carried them. Their names carried them. And the public crisis of Judah entered the most personal spaces of his life. Yet Isaiah's signs were not designed to satisfy curiosity about the future. They demanded decisions in the present. Would Judah learn anything from the fall of the northern kingdom? Would its leaders understand what Assyria had become? Would Jerusalem recognize that the empire was not merely another military problem to be solved through clever diplomacy? For a time, the answer remained uncertain. Hezekiah's reign introduced real reform. The king centralized worship around the Lord, challenged idolatrous practices, and broke with patterns that had marked the reign of Ahaz. The biblical writers remember this positively. But spiritual reform did not remove the pressures of empire. Assyria still dominated the region, and powerful nations rarely release dependent kingdoms simply because a new king has different convictions. Judah remained part of an international system shaped by tribute rebellion alliances and fear. The temptation to search for a human counterweight to Assyria was therefore enormous. If Assyria was the great power in the northeast, where could Judah look for help? One answer seemed obvious: Egypt. For generations, Egypt had represented ancient power to the southwest. Its political strength rose and fell, and during Isaiah's time, Egyptian affairs were also connected with rulers from Cush to the south. But from the viewpoint of Judahite diplomats, Egypt could still appear to offer what they desperately needed: horses, chariots, soldiers, and a coalition strong enough to resist Assyria. Isaiah rejected this confidence with unusual intensity. Again, his objection was not that armies were imaginary. Egypt had armies. Horses were real. Military strength mattered in ordinary political calculation. The problem was the transformation of those things into the foundation of Judah's confidence. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help. Isaiah condemns those who trust in horses and chariots because they are many and strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel. This is the same issue that appeared under Ahaz, only with a different empire. Ahaz looked toward Assyria, others looked toward Egypt. Isaiah's question remained unchanged. What are you trusting in? The prophet even turned his own body into a public warning. During the period associated with Assyria's campaign against Ashdod, Isaiah was instructed to walk stripped of his normal outer clothing and barefoot as a sign concerning Egypt and Cush. The exact visual details should not be exaggerated beyond the text. The point, however, is explicit. The people Judah might expect to rescue them could themselves be led away humiliated before Assyria. Egypt was not an invincible savior. Cush was not an invincible savior. Isaiah's symbolic action attacked the illusion that Judah could escape one great power simply by attaching itself to another. It was an uncomfortable message because international politics rewards visible strength. Isaiah kept pointing toward an invisible throne. This did not make him indifferent to what happened among the nations, quite the opposite. The book contains oracles concerning Babylon, Philistia, Moab, Damascus, Cush, Egypt, Edom, Arabia, Tyre, and other peoples. Isaiah's vision widened beyond Judah because Assyria's rise was reshaping the entire region. But the theological claim beneath these messages was larger than Assyria itself. No empire was ultimate. Assyria could become an instrument of judgment and still be judged for its arrogance. Egypt could appear ancient and powerful and still be vulnerable. Babylon could rise magnificently and still fall. Human kingdoms could dominate maps without controlling history. This is one of the most important, overlooked dimensions of Isaiah. The prophet was not telling Judah that foreign nations were meaningless. He was telling Judah they were not sovereign. Assyria provides the clearest example. Isaiah can describe Assyria as the rod of God's anger, an instrument through which judgment comes. But the Assyrian king does not understand himself that way. He acts from ambition. He boasts in conquest. He treats nations as objects to be gathered. He imagines his success as proof of his own greatness. And so Isaiah turns against the very empire that has been used to punish others. Can an axe boast against the one who swings it? Can a saw magnify itself against the one who uses it? The image reverses the Assyrian king's worldview. The empire believed it was the central actor. Isaiah saw an instrument that had mistaken itself for the hand. That arrogance would not last. A judgment was coming even upon Assyria. The mighty forest would be cut down. Trees would fall. The terrifying empire would not remain forever. And immediately after Isaiah describes this cutting down, another image appears, a shoot coming from the stump of Jesse. Once again, tree stump new growth. Jesse was the father of David. By invoking Jesse, rather than merely speaking of a powerful royal house, Isaiah seems to take the listener back toward the humble origin of the dynasty. The Davidic monarchy might appear damaged, its kings might fail, its political strength might be reduced almost to nothing. But from what looks dead, new life can emerge. Isaiah describes a ruler upon whom the Spirit of the Lord rests, a ruler marked by wisdom, understanding, counsel might knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. He does not judge merely by appearances. He gives justice to the poor. He defends the meek. Righteousness defines his rule. Then Isaiah expands the vision beyond ordinary political reform. Predatory and vulnerable creatures are pictured dwelling together. Violence is transformed. The earth becomes filled with the knowledge of the Lord as waters cover the sea. The imagery is poetic and enormous. The point is unmistakable. Isaiah's hope has moved beyond finding a competent replacement for Ahaz. He is envisioning a fundamentally different kind of rule. The contrast with the kings around him could hardly be stronger. Ahaz trembled before enemies. Assyrian kings boasted in conquest. Human rulers calculated survival. Isaiah envisioned a ruler whose reign was defined by justice and the Spirit of God. But the path toward that future still ran through judgment. Isaiah did not allow the promise of the coming ruler to erase the consequences unfolding in his own generation. The northern kingdom had already fallen. Assyria had demonstrated what it could do, and Judah's political future remained dangerously unstable. Hezekiah had resisted some of the religious failures of his father, but at some point Judah ceased behaving like a loyal Assyrian vassal. Rebellion against Assyria was never a minor diplomatic disagreement. It challenged the imperial order. Sennacherib, who became king of Assyria after Sargon II, faced rebellions in several parts of the empire. His response was military. The Assyrian king moved west. The campaign eventually reached Judah. The world Isaiah had warned about was no longer approaching. It had arrived. One fortified city after another came under pressure. 2 Kings says that Sennacherib attacked the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Assyrian records also boast of his campaign in the region and of trapping Hezekiah in Jerusalem. The sources describe the events from different perspectives, but together they make one fact impossible to ignore. Judah suffered terribly. Jerusalem had not yet fallen, but the kingdom around it was being torn apart. This is where the story becomes more sobering than many simplified retellings. We often move quickly from Assyria invaded to Jerusalem was saved, but between those two statements stood devastated towns, frightened populations, lost territory, and a kingdom being systematically reduced. For people outside the capital, the crisis was not theoretical. Walls failed, families fled, communities faced the machinery of imperial war. One city in particular becomes important, Lachish. Located southwest of Jerusalem, Lachish was one of Judah's major fortified cities. Its position made it strategically significant. Assyria's assault on Lachish was important enough to be celebrated later in royal reliefs at Nineveh. Those images depict the violence and organization of siege warfare, ramps, soldiers, prisoners, and the consequences of defeat. We should be careful not to use later visual reconstructions as though they explain every detail of the biblical narrative. But Lachish gives us something crucial. It helps us feel the scale of the threat facing Jerusalem. Assyria was not bluffing. It had already destroyed cities capable of serious resistance. Its commanders knew siege warfare. Its army had experience. Its king had conquered throughout the region. And now, one of Judah's greatest defensive centers was under Assyrian control. Jerusalem could look toward Lachish and see its possible future. Hezekiah initially attempted to relieve the pressure. 2 Kings records him acknowledging his rebellion against Sennacherib and offering payment. The Assyrian king demanded an enormous tribute of silver and gold. Hezekiah gave what he could from the royal treasury and the temple. The text even says that gold was stripped from the doors and doorposts of the temple. The image is painful. Years earlier, Ahaz had sent temple wealth to Assyria when he wanted imperial help. Now Hezekiah was giving temple wealth to Assyria in an effort to survive imperial punishment. Different kings, different circumstances. But the same empire had become deeply entangled with Judah's fate, and payment did not end the crisis. Assyrian forces still came toward Jerusalem. The confrontation was moving to the walls. Isaiah had been preparing Judah for this moment for years. He had warned them not to imagine that Egypt could guarantee salvation. He had declared that Assyria itself was not ultimate. He had spoken of a remnant. He had pictured arrogant forests being cut down. He had pointed toward a righteous Davidic ruler beyond the failures of the present. But none of those promises meant the coming hours would be easy. In fact, the closer Assyria came, the more difficult trust became. Faith sounds simple when the enemy is distant. It becomes something else when you can see the banners, when refugees are entering the city, when fortified towns have already fallen, when tribute has failed, when the empire outside your walls has defeated kingdoms stronger than yours. Jerusalem prepared. Hezekiah took practical measures to strengthen the city's defenses and protect its water supply. The biblical accounts remember his efforts to secure access to water, including the engineering works associated with bringing water into the city. Preparation was necessary, but Isaiah's warning remained. Walls were not the ultimate foundation. Water systems were not the ultimate foundation. Egypt was not the ultimate foundation. Even a good king was not the ultimate foundation. And the people of Jerusalem were about to hear the Assyrian argument presented with devastating precision. The empire did not merely want to defeat Judah's army, it wanted to defeat Judah's confidence. An Assyrian delegation approached Jerusalem. Among them was an official known by the title Rabshakeh. He came with military authority and a psychological weapon more dangerous than a battering ram: words. He stood near the city and asked the question Isaiah had been asking for years, but from the opposite side. "What confidence is this in which you trust?" The Assyrian officer mocked the idea of relying on Egypt. On that point, his language almost sounded like Isaiah's. Egypt, he said, was like a broken reed that would pierce the hand of anyone leaning on it. Then he went further. He challenged Hezekiah. He challenged Judah's military strength, and finally, he challenged Judah's confidence in the Lord himself. The people on the wall could hear him. That was intentional. Hezekiah's officials asked him to speak in Aramaic rather than the language understood by ordinary Judeans. He refused. He wanted the population to hear. Fear was part of the siege. If the people could be convinced that resistance was hopeless, the city might collapse from within before the walls were breached. The Rabshakeh appealed directly to them. "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. Do not believe he can deliver you. Do not let him persuade you to trust in the Lord. Make peace with Assyria. Surrender. Live." Then came the argument that struck at the heart of Jerusalem's faith. Where were the gods of the other nations? Had they saved their lands from Assyria? Had the gods of Hamath or Arpad stopped the empire? Had Samaria been rescued? Why should Jerusalem be different? From the standpoint of Assyrian experience, the argument was powerful. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen. Capital after capital had failed. Local gods had not stopped the Assyrian army. Why should Judah's God be any different? The challenge was no longer merely political. It had become theological. The empire had reached Jerusalem's walls. The people were listening, and the Assyrian commander had just placed the reputation of the God of Israel beside the defeated gods of conquered nations. For years, Isaiah had warned that Judah's greatest crisis was not simply the power outside its gates. It was the question of trust inside them. Now there was nowhere left to hide from that question. Ahaz had once faced it while enemies approached. He had chosen Assyria. His son Hezekiah now faced it with Assyria standing at the door. And before Jerusalem could discover whether it would survive, its king would have to decide what to do when every visible calculation said the empire was right. The people on Jerusalem's wall heard the Assyrian challenge, and they said nothing. Hezekiah had ordered them not to answer. That silence is one of the most tense moments in Isaiah's story. Outside the walls stood representatives of the most powerful empire in the region. Behind the walls stood a population that knew what Assyria had already done to other cities. The northern kingdom was gone. Lachish had been attacked. Judah's fortified towns had fallen. Tribute had already been paid, and now the Assyrian spokesman was telling Jerusalem that its final source of confidence was an illusion. Do not trust Egypt. Do not trust Hezekiah. Do not trust your God. The first two claims were political. The third transformed the crisis. When Hezekiah's officials returned and reported the words they had heard, the king tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and entered the house of the Lord. The contrast with Ahaz is striking. Years earlier, Ahaz had faced his own terrifying coalition. Isaiah had told him not to fear. But Ahaz had turned toward Assyria. Now his son faced Assyria itself. Hezekiah did not have another greater empire to call. The strategy of his father's generation had reached its logical end. The rescuer had become the threat. The ally had become the invader. And the nation had run out of larger human powers behind which to hide. Hezekiah sent officials and senior priests to Isaiah. Their message was desperate. This was a day of distress, rebuke, and disgrace. Perhaps, they said, the Lord had heard the Assyrian commander's blasphemous words. Perhaps Isaiah would pray for the remnant that still survived. There it was again, the remnant. A theme Isaiah had carried from the beginning now stood inside a military emergency. A remnant shall return was no longer merely the strange name of the prophet's son. Judah itself was becoming a remnant. Most of its fortified landscape had been devastated. The northern kingdom had disappeared. Jerusalem remained. Isaiah's answer was remarkably calm. Do not be afraid because of the words you have heard. The Assyrian king would hear a report. He would return to his own land, and there his story would end. But the pressure did not immediately disappear. The Assyrian representative withdrew and found Sennacherib engaged elsewhere. Then another message came. This time the challenge was delivered directly to Hezekiah in written form. Do not let your God deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be handed over to Assyria. Look at history. Had any other nation survived of Assyria? Where were the kings and gods of the lands Assyria had destroyed? The letter turned Assyria's record of victory into an argument against faith, and from the perspective of ordinary military history, that argument was difficult to answer. Assyria had evidence: destroyed cities, defeated rulers, conquered territories, tribute-bearing kings. An empire could point to the map and say, look what happens to those who resist us. Hezekiah took the letter. Then he carried it into the temple and spread it before the Lord. The gesture is simple, but it marks one of the defining moments of his reign. Hezekiah did not pretend the threat was small. He did not deny Assyria's victories. His prayer explicitly acknowledges them. Yes, the Assyrian kings had devastated nations and lands. Yes, they had thrown their gods into the fire. But Hezekiah makes a crucial distinction. Those gods were products of human hands, wood and stone. The Lord of Israel was not simply one more local deity competing in a regional contest. Hezekiah addresses him as the God enthroned above the cherubim, the God who made heaven and earth. That language takes us back toward Isaiah's original vision. Uzziah had died. Isaiah had seen the true king enthroned. Now Jerusalem's king kneels before that same reality, while another earthly monarch boasts outside the city. The prayer does not ultimately ask for deliverance so that Hezekiah can preserve his reputation. It asks that the kingdoms of the earth may know that the Lord alone is God. The crisis has reached its deepest level. This is no longer simply Jerusalem versus Nineveh. It is a confrontation between Assyria's interpretation of history and Isaiah's. Assyria interprets its victories as proof that nothing can resist its power. Isaiah interprets Assyria itself as a limited instrument inside a history it does not control. Through Isaiah, an answer comes to Hezekiah. The Assyrian king has mocked the Holy One of Israel. He has boasted about mountains crossed, cities entered, forests cut down, and foreign territories conquered. He imagines himself to be the architect of his own greatness. But Isaiah turns the empire's boasting against it. Had Assyria not understood that its ability to devastate fortified cities existed within purposes larger than its own ambition? The empire believed it was writing history. Isaiah told it that even its victories had limits it did not choose. This does not remove human responsibility. Assyria remains arrogant. Its violence remains violence. Its king remains accountable. But the prophet refuses to accept the empire's claim to ultimate sovereignty. Sennacherib may decide where his army marches. He does not decide where history ends. Isaiah then uses humiliating imagery. Because of the Assyrian king's rage and arrogance, God will put a hook in his nose and a bridle in his mouth and turn him back by the way he came. The imagery would have carried a bitter reversal for an Assyrian ruler. Empires displayed conquered enemies as humiliated captives. Now the prophet pictures the conqueror himself being controlled. Then Isaiah speaks once more of survival. The remnant of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. Out of Jerusalem, survivors will come. The empire can cut down cities, it cannot uproot the entire purpose of God. And then comes the promise Jerusalem desperately needs. Sennacherib will not take the city. He will not shoot an arrow there. He will not capture Jerusalem through the siege Isaiah's audience fears. The biblical narrative then describes an extraordinary act of deliverance. An angel of the Lord strikes the Assyrian camp, and the text gives the enormous number of 185,000 dead. By morning, the threat has changed completely. Sennacherib withdraws. He returns to Nineveh. Jerusalem remains standing. For the biblical writer, the meaning is explicit. The city was not saved because its army had suddenly become stronger than Assyria. It was not saved because Egypt arrived with overwhelming force. It was not saved because Judah found a superior diplomatic bargain. The deliverance answered the central question Isaiah had been pressing for years. Assyria was powerful. It was not ultimate. This is also one of those moments where biblical narration and surviving imperial records must be handled carefully rather than forced into a false choice. Sennacherib's own royal inscriptions proudly describe his campaign against Judah. They boast that many fortified cities were captured and that Hezekiah was confined in Jerusalem, famously compared in the Assyrian account to a bird shut inside a cage. The inscriptions also emphasize tribute received from Hezekiah. What they do not say is that Sennacherib captured Jerusalem. That absence does not independently prove every detail of Isaiah's account, nor do Assyrian royal inscriptions exist to provide neutral reporting. Ancient kings recorded their campaigns to celebrate royal power. But the sources agree on something historically significant. Sennacherib invaded Judah. He devastated much of the kingdom. Hezekiah remained in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself did not become another conquered capital celebrated in Sennacherib's victory record. The Bible tells us why. The Assyrian king eventually returned home. Isaiah's prophecy also says that he would die in his own land. Years later, Sennacherib was assassinated by his sons while worshipping in the temple of his god, and another son, Esarhaddon, succeeded him. The man whose official had asked where the gods of conquered nations were could not make himself immortal. The empire continued, but the king did not. Jerusalem had survived the greatest crisis of Hezekiah's reign. This should have been the perfect ending. A faithful king prayed. A prophet spoke. An invading army withdrew. The holy city remained standing. If Isaiah were merely a story about how Judah defeated Assyria through faith, This would be the place to close the book. But Isaiah does not end here. In fact, something deeply unsettling happens next. The city has been saved. The deeper problem has not. That distinction is crucial. A miraculous deliverance can remove an army without removing pride. A national rescue can change political circumstances without changing the human heart. Isaiah's story now turns away from Assyria and toward Hezekiah himself. The king became gravely ill. Isaiah came to him with a message no ruler wants to hear. Set your house in order. You are going to die. Hezekiah turned his face toward the wall and prayed. He reminded the Lord of his faithfulness and wept bitterly. Before Isaiah had even gone far, the word of the Lord came again. Hezekiah's prayer had been heard. His life would be extended by 15 years. Isaiah prescribed treatment for the boil, and the king recovered. A sign involving the shadow moving backward confirmed the promise. Hezekiah's own reflection on the experience, preserved in Isaiah, reveals how deeply death had shaken him. He had expected to be cut off in the prime of life. He had imagined losing his place among the living. His recovery produced gratitude. The king who had watched his nation come close to destruction had now personally come close to death. Jerusalem survived. Hezekiah survived. Yet both deliverances raised the same question. What would be done with the life that remained? Then visitors arrived from Babylon. At first, nothing about them looked like the approach of catastrophe. They did not come as invaders. They came with letters and a gift. The delegation was connected with Merodach-Baladan, a Babylonian ruler who had himself resisted Assyrian domination. Babylon, at this stage, was not yet the empire that would one day destroy Jerusalem. Assyria still dominated the international landscape. That is what makes the episode so easy to underestimate. The danger did not arrive wearing armor. It arrived as diplomacy. The visitors had heard of Hezekiah's illness and recovery. Political interest may also have surrounded such an embassy in a world where resistance to Assyria created potential relationships among smaller powers and rival rulers. The biblical text does not give us permission to reconstruct every secret negotiation, but it tells us exactly what Hezekiah did. He welcomed the envoys, and he showed them everything: silver, gold, spices, precious oil, his armory, his treasuries. There was nothing in his palace or kingdom that he did not display. Why Isaiah does not give a long psychological explanation. Chronicles adds an important note, saying that in connection with the Babylonian envoys, God left Hezekiah to test him and know what was in his heart. And it also speaks of the king's pride in the wider account of his prosperity. We should therefore resist inventing a private conversation Scripture never records. But we are not left without a warning. The king who had once brought an Assyrian letter into the temple now proudly opened his treasures before Babylon. Isaiah came to him. What did these men say? Where did they come from? Hezekiah answered, from a distant country, from Babylon. Then Isaiah asked the question that exposed everything. What have they seen in your house? Hezekiah's answer was complete. Everything. Nothing had been hidden. Then the prophet changed the horizon of the book. Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Days were coming when everything stored in Hezekiah's palace would be carried to Babylon. Nothing would be left. Even some of his own descendants would be taken away and serve in the palace of the Babylonian king. The words must have sounded strange. Babylon had not just surrounded Jerusalem, Assyria had. Assyria had destroyed Judah's cities. Assyria had threatened the capital. Assyria was the empire everyone feared. Yet Isaiah looked beyond the immediate superpower. He saw another exile, another empire, another catastrophe. Jerusalem's escape from Sennacherib had not cancelled Judah's future accountability. Assyria had been stopped at the walls. Babylon would one day pass through them. Hezekiah responded that the word of the Lord was good, and the text records his thought that there would at least be peace and security in his own days. Readers have long heard different shades in that response. There is submission to the prophetic word, but there is also something uncomfortable about the relief that the disaster will fall beyond the king's own lifetime. Whatever mixture existed in Hezekiah's heart, the narrative closes this stage with a devastating change in direction. The great Assyrian crisis is over. The Babylonian crisis has been announced. That is why the movement from Isaiah 39 into Isaiah 40 is so powerful. The first half of the book has been dominated by warning King's Assyria judgment and the struggle to trust. At the end of chapter 39, Isaiah looks into a future where Judah's treasures are gone and its people face exile in Babylon. If the book stopped there, the story would end with delayed disaster. But it does not stop there. After the announcement of exile comes one of the most astonishing changes in tone in all of Isaiah. Comfort, comfort my people. The prophet who had spent decades warning Jerusalem that judgment was real now begins speaking to a horizon beyond that judgment. Beyond Assyria, beyond Hezekiah, beyond the coming Babylonian exile. The city had survived one empire. It would not survive every consequence. But Isaiah was about to reveal that even exile would not be the end, and the restoration he saw would become far larger than simply rebuilding what Babylon would destroy. Comfort, comfort my people. After 39 chapters shaped by accusation, warning, political crisis, Assyrian invasion, and the announcement of future exile, those words feel almost impossible. The tone has changed. But the God speaking has not. That is the clue that changes the way we understand the entire book of Isaiah. Judgment was never the destination. It was part of the road. Isaiah has just told Hezekiah that Babylon will one day carry Judah's treasures away. Descendants of the royal house will be taken. The future appears to end in loss. Then the prophetic horizon moves beyond that catastrophe. Isaiah begins speaking as though the devastated generation can already hear words from the other side of exile. Jerusalem has suffered. Her warfare is ending. Her guilt has been dealt with. A voice cries in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." The image is not primarily of people struggling to find their own road home. It is of God Himself coming to lead His people. Valleys rise, mountains are lowered, uneven ground becomes level. A highway opens through the wilderness. The imagery echoes one of Israel's oldest memories, the Exodus. Once Israel had been trapped beneath Pharaoh. God brought the people out of Egypt, led them through the wilderness, and formed them into a covenant nation. Now Isaiah looks toward another deliverance. This time, the oppressor is associated with Babylon. This time, the journey moves toward a ruined Jerusalem. But the pattern is familiar. Bondage, deliverance, wilderness, return, presence, restoration. Isaiah is beginning to describe what could be called a new Exodus. And yet, something about this new Exodus is already larger than the first. The prophet announces good news from Zion. The cities of Judah are told, "Behold your God. The Lord comes with power." Yet Isaiah immediately pairs that strength with another image, a shepherd. He gathers lambs in his arms. He carries them close. The God who judges nations is also the God who gathers a scattered flock. This combination runs through Isaiah's restoration message: power without cruelty, holiness without abandonment, judgment without the destruction of promise. The exiles may believe their way has been hidden from God. Isaiah answers by pointing beyond the scale of empire. Who created the stars? Who brings out their host? who calls each one by name. Babylon may control territories, it does not control the heavens. Kings rise because history gives them a moment. The Creator does not grow tired. The people may become weary, God does not. That is why one of Isaiah's most familiar promises appears here. Those who wait for the Lord will renew their strength. They will rise with wings like eagles. They will run and not be weary. They will walk and not faint. In context, these are not decorative words for people having a difficult afternoon. They are words for a community facing the possibility that everything familiar has been lost. Land, temple, political independence, dynasty, security. Isaiah is teaching them to distinguish between the collapse of their institutions and the collapse of God's purpose. They are not the same thing. That distinction becomes essential because Babylon will look permanent when exile arrives. Empires often do. A generation grows up beneath them. Their language fills administration. Their armies control roads. Their monuments dominate cities. Their kings call themselves masters of the world. And then history changes. Isaiah now introduces a ruler who would have sounded astonishing to his earlier audience, a conqueror rising from the east. Later, the prophet gives him a name, Cyrus. This is one of the most remarkable turns in Isaiah. Cyrus was the Persian king whose conquests brought the Neo-Babylonian Empire to an end in the 6th century before Christ. The biblical books of Ezra and Chronicles connect his reign with the decree allowing Judean exiles to return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Isaiah's restoration vision, therefore, does not remain abstract. It enters political history again. Just as Assyria had been a real empire and Babylon would become a real captor, Persia would become part of the story of return. But Isaiah describes Cyrus in language that surprises many readers. The Lord calls him his shepherd. Even more strikingly, Isaiah 45 refers to Cyrus as his anointed. The Hebrew term behind that word is the term from which Messiah comes. That does not mean Cyrus becomes the ultimate Messiah of biblical hope. It means that in this specific context, a foreign king is appointed for a task within God's purpose. He will defeat rulers. Babylon will fall. The path toward return will open. A Persian ruler who does not belong to the Davidic dynasty becomes an instrument through whom Israel's God changes the political world. The irony is enormous. Judah had repeatedly looked toward foreign empires for security. Now God would use a foreign ruler to release his people without asking them to worship that ruler as their savior. Isaiah makes the hierarchy clear. Cyrus acts. God directs the larger purpose. The king may not know the Lord in Israel's covenant sense, but he can still be used within a history larger than himself. This is another reversal of imperial ideology. Babylon might imagine that its gods had defeated Judah's God because Jerusalem fell. Isaiah mocks that conclusion. The idols of Babylon cannot carry themselves. Bel and Nebo have to be loaded onto animals. The gods supposedly responsible for imperial greatness become baggage. They are carried. The God of Israel says something entirely different to his people. I have carried you from birth through age, even to gray hairs. I will carry and will save. The contrast is deliberate. An idol must be transported by worshippers. The Lord transports his people. Babylon's religion displays gods being carried in procession. Isaiah presents Israel's God carrying the remnant through history. That is why exile does not prove that Babylon has won the theological argument. Jerusalem can fall without the Lord becoming weak. The temple can be destroyed without heaven's throne being overturned. The people can be displaced without the covenant story disappearing. But this raises a deeper question. If Cyrus can open Babylon's gates, what exactly is Israel's greatest problem? Is exile only geographical? If the people travel from Babylon back to Judah, has restoration been completed? Isaiah increasingly suggests that the answer is no, because the problem that sent Judah into exile existed long before Babylon arrived. Isaiah had seen it in chapter 1. Rebellion, injustice, false worship, unclean lips, misplaced trust, blindness, a hardened heart. An army can be removed, a king can issue a decree, a road can lead home, but none of those things automatically transform the human heart. This is where another figure begins to move toward the center of Isaiah's vision, the servant of the Lord. The language of servant in Isaiah requires care because the book does not use it in only one simple way. At times, Israel itself is explicitly called God's servant. Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. The nation has a calling. Israel was meant to know the Lord, bear witness to him, and reflect his purposes among the nations. Yet Isaiah also describes Israel as blind. The servant who should see does not see. The witness who should hear does not hear. The nation chosen for a purpose has itself become part of the problem. Then Isaiah introduces servant passages in which the figure appears to carry out the mission with a faithfulness that failed Israel has not consistently displayed. The first great portrait appears quietly. Behold my servant, whom I uphold. He is chosen. God delights in him. The Spirit rests upon him. He brings justice to the nations. But he does not arrive like an Assyrian conqueror. He does not shout in the streets to establish domination. A bruised reed he will not break. A faintly burning wick he will not extinguish. The imagery could hardly contrast more sharply with the empires surrounding Isaiah's world. Assyria boasts, Babylon conquers, imperial kings break opposition. The servant brings justice without becoming another tyrant. And his mission extends beyond Judah, beyond Israel, to the nations. This has been present in Isaiah from the beginning. The prophet had envisioned nations streaming to Zion. He had spoken of a root associated with Jesse drawing the peoples. Now the servant becomes connected with a mission reaching outward. Isaiah's restoration is refusing to stay small. Israel returns, but the nations matter. Zion rises, but the world is watching. A covenant people is restored, but the ultimate goal is not ethnic isolation. The knowledge of the Lord must spread farther. This becomes even clearer as the servant's mission develops. In one passage, the servant appears to have a mission toward Jacob and Israel. He is called to bring Jacob back. Yet then the scope expands. It is too light a thing for the mission to end there. The servant is made a light for the nations so that salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. That language will later become extremely important in the New Testament. But here, before we rush ahead, we need to feel how radical it is inside Isaiah itself. The prophet began with one corrupt city, Jerusalem. Then the horizon widened to Judah, then Israel, then Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, and other nations. Now restoration itself is moving toward the ends of the earth. The story has become much larger than national survival, and yet the servant's path is becoming more difficult. Isaiah does not describe him simply receiving applause from the restored community. He encounters rejection, opposition, humiliation. In one servant passage, the speaker says that the Lord gave him the tongue of one who is taught, so that he might sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning he listens. He does not turn backward. Then the suffering begins. He gives his back to those who strike him, his cheeks to those who pull out the beard. He does not hide his face from disgrace and spitting. Still he trusts that the Lord will help him. The theme that Isaiah had preached to kings now appears inside the servant's own experience. Trust. Ahaz failed the test of trust. Judah repeatedly failed it. The servant walks through suffering without abandoning it. Something is changing, but Isaiah has not yet reached the most startling description of the servant. That will come later. For now, the restoration horizon continues expanding. The prophet speaks to Zion as though she were a woman who believes she has been forgotten. The Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me. The answer is one of Isaiah's most intimate images. Can a mother forget the child she nurses? Even if that were possible, the Lord says, I will not forget you. Zion's walls are continually before him. The city that will be reduced to ruins is spoken to as though restoration is already being prepared. Her children will return. Her desolate places will become crowded. The nations themselves will become involved in bringing people home. Kings and queens appear in images of service to Zion. The restoration of Israel begins to affect the international order. Again, Isaiah refuses to let Babylon write the final sentence. This does not mean the exile was insignificant. The prophet never treats suffering lightly. Ruins are still ruins. Loss is still loss. Judgment was deserved and devastating. But judgment has a boundary. God's covenant purpose does not. That is why Isaiah repeatedly calls the people to remember the past differently. Remember Abraham and Sarah. Look at the rock from which you were cut. Abraham was one man when God called him, yet God multiplied him. If God could begin a nation from what seemed impossible, a devastated remnant was not too small for restoration. The past becomes evidence for hope. Then Isaiah reaches even farther back. The language of Exodus returns. Awake, arm of the Lord. Was it not you who dried up the sea, who made the depths a road for the redeemed to cross? The old deliverance becomes a pattern for the new one. The ransomed of the Lord will return. They will come to Zion with singing. Sorrow and sighing will flee. But the new Exodus contains a striking difference. When Israel left Egypt, the people departed in haste. Isaiah tells the future community that this departure will not be the same. They will not go out in panic. They will not flee as though Babylon still controls their fate. The Lord will go before them. The God of Israel will be their rear guard. A path home is opening. Babylon's power is temporary. Cyrus will play his assigned role. Zion will be restored. But immediately after this language of departure and return, Isaiah presents the servant again, and now the mystery deepens. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He will be exalted, raised, lifted high. Those words sound like triumph, but the next image is shocking. His appearance is marred. People are appalled. Kings will eventually become silent because of him. Exaltation and suffering have suddenly been placed beside each other. The reader has reached the threshold of Isaiah 53. And here the deeper question of restoration can no longer be avoided. If Babylon is defeated, why does the servant need to suffer? If Cyrus can send the exiles home, why does Isaiah describe another figure bearing grief, rejection, and something connected to the sins of others? Because political liberation, however extraordinary, cannot by itself repair everything. Exile revealed. Judah's deepest captivity did not begin when Babylonian soldiers arrived. It began in the rebellion Isaiah had condemned from the opening chapter. The city needed more than reconstructed walls. The people needed more than a restored economy. Israel needed more than another political opportunity. The broken relationship between a holy God and a sinful people still stood at the center of the story. And Isaiah was about to describe a servant whose suffering somehow enters that problem directly. The prophet, who had once cried, "Woe is me," because he was unclean, had seen his guilt removed through an act of atonement. Now his book was moving toward a far larger picture of suffering, guilt, and restoration. The return from Babylon was real, but it was not yet the full return Isaiah had been preparing us to see. The road home had opened. The deeper exile remained, and the servant was about to step into it. The servant had entered the story quietly, chosen, empowered by the Spirit, called to bring justice, sent toward Israel, sent beyond Israel, a light to the nations. But now Isaiah brings us to the place where the servant's mission becomes more difficult to explain. He will succeed, and he will suffer. He will be exalted, and he will be humiliated. He will somehow deal with a problem deeper than Babylon. Isaiah 52 begins the final great servant passage with a command, "Behold my servant." The language that follows sounds triumphant. He will act wisely. He will prosper in his mission. He will be raised. He will be lifted up. He will be highly exalted. If the passage stopped there, the reader might expect another victorious king, perhaps another Cyrus, perhaps a military deliverer, perhaps someone who restores national strength. But almost immediately, the image changes. People are appalled at him. His appearance is disfigured. His suffering is so severe that the one announced as exalted first appears broken. Then nations and kings become involved. Kings shut their mouths because of him. Those who had not been told will see. Those who had not heard will understand. Once again, the mission reaches beyond Israel. Then the voice shifts. Who has believed what he has heard from us? The servant does not enter the story with the appearance people expect. He grows like a young plant, like a root coming from dry ground. There is no outward majesty that compels admiration. He is despised, rejected, a man acquainted with suffering. People turn their faces away. And then Isaiah introduces the interpretation that changes everything. The servant's suffering is not described merely as unfortunate persecution. It is connected to others. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. The speakers had interpreted his suffering one way. They assumed he was struck by God because of his own condition. Then they realized something else. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The language moves from observation to confession. Our griefs, our sorrows, our transgressions, our iniquities. Isaiah is no longer describing only the suffering of one righteous individual. He is describing suffering that somehow carries the wrongdoing of others. The contrast with earlier chapters is enormous. At the beginning of Isaiah, Judah itself was pictured as wounded from head to foot because of rebellion. The nation carried the consequences of its own sin. Here, the servant is wounded in connection with the sins of others. The people had wandered. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each had turned to his own way, but Isaiah says the Lord laid upon the servant the iniquity of them all. That statement forces us back to the deeper problem of exile. Babylon could imprison bodies, but Babylon did not create Judah's rebellion. Babylon could destroy Jerusalem, but Babylon did not invent injustice, idolatry, pride, or unbelief. Those failures existed before the empire arrived. Cyrus could defeat Babylon, but Cyrus could not carry the guilt of the people. A royal decree could open the road to Jerusalem. It could not automatically create a holy people. That is why Isaiah's restoration vision requires something more than geopolitical change. A new exodus needs a deeper act of rescue. The servant enters that need. He is oppressed. He is afflicted. Yet Isaiah describes him as not opening his mouth. Like a lamb led toward slaughter. Like a sheep silent before those who shear it. The image is not one of weakness in the simple sense. Earlier servant passages have already described deliberate obedience. The servant listens. He does not turn back, he trusts. Now that obedience continues through suffering. He is taken away through oppression and judgment. He is cut off from the land of the living. He is assigned a grave with the wicked. Yet Isaiah also connects his burial with the rich. The language is compressed, poetic, and difficult. But the central claim becomes increasingly clear. The servant suffers despite not being characterized by violence or deceit. His suffering cannot be explained as ordinary punishment for his own wrongdoing. Then Isaiah goes further still. His life is described as an offering for guilt. Sacrificial language enters the passage. And yet, death does not appear to terminate his mission. After the suffering, Isaiah speaks of the servant seeing the result of his anguish. He will justify many. He will bear their iniquities. He receives a portion with the great. The one who was despised is vindicated. The one who was rejected is exalted. The one who was treated as guilty bears the sin of others. The one apparently defeated becomes the agent through whom many are counted righteous. This is one of the theological peaks of Isaiah, but it must be handled carefully. Within Isaiah itself, the servant theme has developed through multiple passages and uses of the word servant. Israel has been called God's servant. Yet Israel is also depicted as blind and in need of restoration. The servant in these passages carries out a mission connected with Israel and, in some texts, toward Israel. That complexity has generated centuries of interpretation. Jewish interpreters have read the servant texts in several ways, including corporate readings connected with Israel and readings involving particular righteous figures. Christian interpretation following the New Testament sees Isaiah 52 through 53 as profoundly fulfilled in Jesus. The important point for our journey is not to pretend that Isaiah's poetry has no context until the New Testament appears. Its context has been building for chapters. Failure, exile, return, Israel's calling, Israel's blindness, the nations, a faithful servant, suffering, atonement, vindication. Then when the New Testament later applies these words to Jesus, it is entering an already developed story rather than borrowing an isolated prediction. The Gospels describe Jesus using language and patterns drawn from Isaiah. Acts records Philip meeting an Ethiopian official, reading the passage about the sheep led to slaughter, and explaining the good news about Jesus from that text. 1 Peter also uses language strongly shaped by Isaiah 53 when speaking about Christ's suffering and the sins of others. Christian readers, therefore, do not make the connection merely because the imagery sounds similar. The New Testament itself makes it. But Isaiah's story still does not end in chapter 53. That is one of the most important things many retellings miss. If Isaiah 53 is treated as the conclusion, we lose the consequences of the servant's work. Immediately after the suffering servant comes a call to sing. The barren woman is told to rejoice. The tent must be enlarged, the cords lengthened, the stakes strengthened. Why? Because what appears empty is about to become full. Restoration is expanding. The imagery moves from one suffering figure to a renewed community. Zion, once pictured as abandoned, will not remain abandoned. Fear will not define her forever. Her shame will not be permanent. The covenant language becomes intimate. For a brief moment, Isaiah says, it may have seemed as though God had hidden his face. But with everlasting compassion, he gathers his people. The prophet reaches back to Noah. Just as the waters of Noah became connected with a divine promise concerning the earth, Isaiah speaks of enduring covenant mercy. Mountains may depart, hills may be removed, but the Lord's covenant of peace will not be removed. Jerusalem is then pictured almost like a precious city rebuilt after devastation. Stones, foundations, gates, beauty after ruin. But physical reconstruction is not the final point. The children of Zion will be taught by the Lord. Great will be their peace. Righteousness becomes part of the city's stability. Again, Isaiah refuses to reduce restoration to architecture. Walls can be rebuilt while hearts remain rebellious. The prophet is looking for something deeper. Then comes one of the widest invitations in the book. Come, everyone who thirsts. Not only kings, not only priests, not only the wealthy, everyone who thirsts. Come to the waters. Come even without money. Buy and eat. The language is intentionally paradoxical. A gift of enormous value is offered without ordinary economic exchange. Why spend money on what does not satisfy it? Why labor for what cannot give life? Listen, come, live. Then Isaiah connects the invitation with the covenant promises associated with David. The Davidic hope has not disappeared. But now the covenant horizon touches the nations. A nation unknown to Israel will run toward the restored people because of the Lord. The future Isaiah sees is not simply Judah becoming wealthy again. It is a reordered relationship between God, His people, Davidic promise, and the nations. That is why Isaiah calls people to seek the Lord while He may be found. The return from exile has a spiritual dimension. The wicked must forsake his way. The unrighteous must leave his thoughts. The Lord will have compassion. He will abundantly pardon. Then Isaiah reminds the listener that God's thoughts are not reducible to human expectations. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so His ways are higher. That verse is often quoted in isolation, as though its primary message were that God is mysterious whenever life is confusing. But in context, the surprising thought is connected with mercy. People are called to return because God is more ready to pardon than they might imagine. The distance between divine and human ways is not merely a distance of incomprehensibility. It reveals the astonishing scale of God's redemptive purpose. His word will accomplish what He sends it to do. Rain comes from heaven and causes the earth to produce. So God's word will not return empty. It will accomplish His purpose. And what does that purpose look like? You shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The language of Exodus appears again. Mountains and hills burst into song. Trees clap their hands. Thorns give way to cypress. Briars give way to myrtle. The environment itself becomes poetic witness to restoration. The curse-like imagery of disorder begins to reverse. This is no longer just a road from Babylon to Jerusalem. Isaiah is gradually moving towards something that looks like creation itself being renewed. But before we reach that final horizon, the prophet introduces another uncomfortable truth. A community can return from exile and still fail. That is why the later chapters of Isaiah refuse to become a simple victory celebration. Restoration brings responsibility. The people must practice justice. Foreigners who join themselves to the Lord are welcomed into an expanding vision. Unique people who could experience exclusion within aspects of Israel's social and cultic world are promised an enduring name within God's house when they hold fast to His covenant. The temple is described as a house of prayer for all peoples. That phrase will later appear in the Gospels when Jesus confronts corruption around the temple. But here in Isaiah, the idea belongs to the widening restoration vision. God gathers the outcasts of Israel, and He speaks of gathering still others. The borders of the restored community are being reconsidered around faithfulness to the Lord. This would have been easy to miss if we stopped the story with Cyrus. Cyrus can permit Jews to return. He cannot define the ultimate character of the restored people. That question belongs to God. Who will inhabit the renewed Zion? What kind of worship will define them? What kind of justice? What kind of faithfulness? Isaiah's answer becomes increasingly demanding. Because religious corruption can survive exile, leaders can become blind again. watchmen can fail. People can pursue idols. The outward forms of fasting can continue while exploitation remains untouched. Suddenly the opening chapters of Isaiah seem close again. The problem that existed before Jerusalem's destruction has returned. People ask why God has not noticed their fasting. Isaiah exposes the contradiction. They fast while oppressing workers. They engage in religious acts while fighting and quarreling. Is that the fast God chooses? To bow the head temporarily, to lie in sackcloth? Or does true devotion involve loosening the bonds of wickedness, freeing the oppressed, sharing bread with the hungry, bringing the poor into one's house, and clothing the naked? The language sounds like Isaiah chapter 1 because the theological problem is the same. Ritual without righteousness, worship without justice, religion without transformed relationships. The exile did not automatically cure it. This is one of the most important consequences to follow. If the people can return to the land and still reproduce the sins that contributed to exile, then geographical return cannot be Isaiah's ultimate definition of restoration. Something greater is still required. The prophet begins describing what happens when justice becomes real. Light breaks forth like dawn. Ruins are rebuilt. Ancient foundations are restored. The people become repairers of broken walls and restorers of streets. But Isaiah continues moving between glorious promise and severe confrontation. Why? Because the restored community still lives between what God has promised and what human beings continue to be. This tension prepares another major declaration. The Spirit of the Lord is upon an anointed herald. He is sent to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives, freedom to prisoners, to announce the year of the Lord's favor. These words appear in Isaiah 61, and centuries later Luke's Gospel records Jesus reading this passage in the synagogue at Nazareth and declaring that the scripture had been fulfilled in the hearing of those present. Again, the New Testament deliberately takes Isaiah's restoration language and places it within the mission of Jesus. But in Isaiah's own flow, the announcement belongs to a world still waiting for Zion's full transformation. Mourners need comfort. Ruins need rebuilding. Generations of devastation need repair. The people need righteousness. The nations need to see. Isaiah speaks of those who mourn receiving beauty instead of ashes, gladness instead of mourning, praise instead of a faint spirit. Restored people become like oaks of righteousness, strong, planted, displaying the Lord's glory. Yet the restoration remains public. Nations will see righteousness. Kings will see glory. Zion receives a new name. The city once called forsaken will no longer be defined by abandonment. The land once called desolate will be spoken of with delight. The relationship between God and his people is described with the joy of a bridegroom over a bride. This is not merely political recovery. It is relational restoration. But then Isaiah places watchmen on Jerusalem's walls. They are not allowed to remain silent. They call upon the Lord until Jerusalem becomes a praise in the earth. The city has been promised restoration, but the prophetic posture is still one of longing. Promise does not eliminate waiting. Hope does not mean everything has already arrived. This is the tension the final chapters must resolve. Isaiah began his ministry in a Jerusalem filled with religious activity and moral corruption. He saw the holy God. He warned kings. He watched Assyria devour the northern kingdom and devastate Judah. He announced Babylonian exile before Babylon became Judah's final conqueror. Then he looked beyond exile towards Cyrus and return. But return was not enough. He saw a servant whose suffering addressed guilt. He saw nations entering the horizon of salvation. He saw the outcast gathered. He saw justice and worship reunited. He saw good news announced to the broken. He saw Zion renamed. And yet one question remained. What happens when people come home, but sin comes home with them? If restored Jerusalem can still experience injustice, false worship, and rebellion, then what would it take for God's promises to reach their true destination? Isaiah's final answer would move beyond a repaired city, beyond a restored temple, beyond the return of one generation, beyond even the political survival of Israel. The prophet would look toward a transformation so complete that he needed the language of creation itself to describe it. A new heavens, a new earth. And before that vision appears, Isaiah will make one final distinction between the restoration people can build and the restoration only God can bring. Isaiah's vision has carried us a remarkable distance, from the throne room of a holy God to the palace of frightened kings, from Assyria's armies to Babylonian exile, from Cyrus and the promise of return to the suffering servant, from devastated Zion to a restored people called to justice, mercy, and faithful worship. But Isaiah still refuses to end where many retellings end. He does not stop with the exiles coming home. He does not stop with Jerusalem being rebuilt. He does not even stop with the servants suffering, because the final chapters reveal a difficult truth. You can leave Babylon and still carry Babylon in the heart. You can return to sacred ground and still practice injustice. You can rebuild religious institutions and still resist the God those institutions are supposed to honor. A change of geography is not the same thing as a change of character. That problem has followed Isaiah from the beginning. In chapter 1, Jerusalem was filled with sacrifices, assemblies, prayers, and festivals. Yet injustice remained. Now, near the end of the book, religious people again seek God. They fast, they perform acts of devotion. They ask why God does not appear impressed. Isaiah's answer sounds almost like the prophet has returned to the first days of his ministry. The outward act is not enough. A fast that leaves oppression untouched is incomplete. Worship that does not reshape relationships has missed the point. The people may bow their heads, they may wear signs of mourning, but if workers are exploited, the hungry ignored, and the vulnerable abandoned, religious intensity cannot disguise moral failure. The same disease has survived the crisis. This is why restoration must become something greater. Isaiah begins to describe two communities emerging within the same story. There are those who seek the Lord, those who tremble at his word, those who repent, those who pursue justice, and there are those who persist in rebellion while still assuming religious identity will protect them. This distinction becomes increasingly important. The prophet is no longer dealing only with Judah versus foreign nations. The deepest dividing line runs through the covenant community itself. Who truly listens? Who truly trusts? Who welcomes God's restoration? Who resists it? Isaiah had confronted this problem from the day of his calling. He had been sent to people who could hear words without truly hearing them. Now at the end of the book, the issue remains, but so does the promise. The Lord declares that heaven is his throne and earth his footstool. No building can contain him. No human structure can make him dependent upon the people who constructed it. The temple matters. Jerusalem matters. Worship matters. But the Creator cannot be reduced to a religious system controlled by human hands. Then comes the person to whom God looks, the humble, the contrite in spirit, the one who trembles at his word. This reverses the assumptions of power. Isaiah has spent decades watching kings, armies, empires, and political elites shape the visible world. But divine attention is drawn toward humility. The Assyrian king had boasted about everything he had conquered. Ahaz trusted the power he could purchase. Babylon would celebrate its glory. God looks toward the contrite. That contrast may be one of the quietest revolutions in Isaiah. The future does not belong simply to the strongest person in the room. Then the prophet turns again to judgment. Isaiah does not allow restoration to become sentimental. Persistent rebellion still matters. Idolatry still matters. Violence still matters. The Lord's coming brings salvation to some and judgment to others. The book began with that tension, and it ends with it. Hope does not mean that evil is ignored. In Isaiah, genuine restoration requires evil to be confronted. Otherwise, the oppressed would be asked to celebrate a future in which oppression simply continues. A world made new cannot be a world where injustice receives eternal permission to survive. That is why judgment and restoration remain connected until the end. The same holy God Isaiah saw in the temple is still the God of the final chapters. His holiness was terrifying in Isaiah 6. It remains terrifying to rebellion. But that holiness also becomes the foundation of hope, because if God were indifferent to evil, Isaiah's promises of justice would mean nothing. The poor would never truly be defended. The violent would never be answered. The broken would never know that what happened to them mattered. Isaiah's hope depends upon God's holiness as much as his warnings do. Then the horizon expands again. The nations return to the center of the story. God declares that he knows their works and thoughts. But he also speaks of gathering nations and languages to see his glory. That is an extraordinary ending for a book so deeply rooted in Judah's crisis. Isaiah began speaking to Jerusalem. He ends looking at peoples across the world. The nations are not merely distant observers. They are drawn into the final vision. Messengers go out. People who have not heard the Lord's fame will hear. They will declare his glory among the nations. And people from those nations participate in bringing others toward God's holy mountain. The movement is no longer simply Babylon back to Jerusalem. It has become the glory of God outward to the nations, and the nations moving toward worship. This fulfills a theme Isaiah had introduced long before exile. In the opening chapters, he saw the mountain of the Lord's house exalted. Nations streamed toward it. They came to learn God's ways. Now, at the end of the book, the nations return. The vision has survived everything between. Kings failed, Israel divided, Samaria fell, Assyria invaded, Jerusalem faced destruction. Babylonian exile was announced. Yet the purpose extending beyond Israel was never abandoned. And Isaiah goes further. God speaks of taking even some from among the nations for priestly and Levitical service. The precise interpretation of this difficult language has been discussed in different ways, but the direction of the vision is unmistakable. Isaiah's restored world is astonishingly expansive. The prophet who lived inside the political vulnerability of one small kingdom sees worship reaching far beyond its borders. Yet even this is not the final step. Isaiah now reaches for language so large that ordinary political vocabulary is no longer sufficient. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. This is the destination toward which the book has been moving. Not simply a new king, not simply the defeat of Assyria, not simply the fall of Babylon, not simply a second chance for Judah. New heavens, new earth, creation language. To feel the weight of this, remember where Isaiah began. He opened with a wounded nation. He described a land devastated by rebellion. Cities burned, justice corrupted, leaders failed, the social order fractured. Then he began to speak of trees, vineyards, wildernesses, deserts, rivers, mountains, animals, and roads transformed. Nature itself repeatedly participated in the poetry of restoration. The desert would blossom. Water would appear in wilderness. Thorns would give way to better growth. Predatory violence would be transformed. Mountains would sing. Trees would clap their hands. These were not random decorations. Isaiah's imagery had been preparing the listener for a restoration larger than one political event. The final vision makes that explicit. Creation itself becomes the scale. The former troubles no longer define the people. Jerusalem is created as a joy. Her people become a delight. Weeping and cries of distress no longer dominate the city. Life is pictured in terms of stability rather than premature loss. People build houses and inhabit them. They plant vineyards and enjoy their fruit. They are no longer trapped in the pattern of laboring only for invaders to take what they built. This is deeply connected to Isaiah's historical world. Empires had done exactly that. An army could invade. A city could fall. A family's crops could become another nation's spoil. People could build and lose, plant and never harvest, live under the constant threat that the powerful would take what ordinary households had created. Isaiah's restored world reverses that insecurity. People enjoy the work of their hands. Their labor is no longer swallowed by conquest. Peace becomes material. It reaches homes, fields, families, daily life. Then the imagery from Isaiah 11 returns. Wolf and lamb, predator and prey. Peace extending even into poetic images of the animal world. The book is tying its own threads together. The righteous rule Isaiah once associated with the shoot from Jesse belonged to a future in which the earth was filled with the knowledge of the Lord. Now the new creation vision ends with similar imagery. What looked like separate prophecies were part of one expanding hope. But Isaiah's description of new creation also requires careful reading. Some features are expressed through the language of idealized human life familiar to Isaiah's audience. The passage speaks of long life building, planting descendants, and worship. We should not flatten every poetic image into a technical chart of future chronology. Isaiah is painting. He is showing what it means for curse, loss, violence, and futility to be overcome. The central claim is larger than any single interpretive system. God's restoration reaches creation itself. And yet, there is one more surprising element. Isaiah connects the new heavens and new earth with continuing worship. From new moon to new moon, from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh comes to worship before the Lord. The book that began with God rejecting corrupt religious observances ends with universal worship made right. That is a remarkable reversal. In chapter 1, festivals could become hateful because the people's lives contradicted their worship. At the end, worship and righteousness are no longer divided. The problem was never that worship itself was meaningless. The problem was hypocrisy. Isaiah's final world heals that fracture. The God who once rejected hands stained with violence receives the worship of a renewed creation. But Isaiah refuses to allow the final image to become comfortable in a superficial way. The book closes with a disturbing picture of judgment upon rebellion. That ending has unsettled readers for centuries. Why not conclude only with the beauty of new creation? Because Isaiah never separates salvation from the defeat of evil. The final future is not created by pretending rebellion caused no damage. Justice remains serious to the end. The contrast between life with God and persistent resistance to Him is allowed to stand. This prevents us from turning Isaiah into only a book of comforting quotations. The comfort is real, but it is costly. It comes through judgment, through exile, through repentance, through the servant, through divine intervention. Isaiah's hope is not optimism about human civilization gradually improving itself. The prophet has seen too much human failure for that. Ahaz failed. The northern kingdom failed. Judah failed. Foreign empires were arrogant. Even Hezekiah, one of the better kings, was not the final answer. A restored community could repeat old patterns. Human institutions could be rebuilt without eliminating sin. So Isaiah's final hope rests elsewhere. God acts, God gathers, God judges, God saves, God creates. That is the trajectory. And now if we place the entire book beside itself, a pattern emerges that is easy to miss when individual passages are read only in isolation. Isaiah saw a holy king. Human kings proved inadequate. He saw a sinful people. Judgment came. He saw a remnant. The promise survived. He saw Assyria rise. Assyria was limited. He saw Babylon ahead. Babylon would not be final. He named Cyrus. A way home opened. He saw the servant. The deeper problem of guilt entered the center of the restoration story. He saw Zion renewed. The nations were drawn toward God's glory. And finally, he saw new creation. The entire movement can be summarized in one long arc, from corrupted Jerusalem to renewed creation. That is why Isaiah cannot be reduced to the prophet who predicted Jesus. That description is too small. It is also why Isaiah cannot be reduced to an 8th century political commentator. That description is too small as well. He is deeply rooted in his own century, and his book repeatedly looks beyond it. The historical crises give the prophecy its shape. The larger theological vision gives those crises meaning beyond their immediate moment. This is where we also need to distinguish between what the text makes certain, what it strongly suggests, and what later readers debate. Certain, Isaiah's message combines judgment and restoration. Certain, Assyria and Babylon matter deeply to the book's historical world. Certain, the servant occupies a major role in the restoration vision. Certain nations are included in the widening horizon. Certain book culminates in the language of new heavens and new earth. Beyond those points, questions become more complex. How should every servant passage relate to Israel and to an individual figure? How should near historical fulfillments relate to larger future horizons? How should every poetic image in the new creation passages be mapped onto later eschatological expectations? Readers have disagreed. Responsible interpretation does not require pretending those disagreements do not exist. But uncertainty about some details must not hide what Isaiah makes overwhelmingly clear. Judgment is not God's final purpose for his people. Exile is not the final horizon. Empire is not sovereign. Sin cannot simply be ignored. Restoration must go deeper than political return. The nations are not forgotten, and the final hope is cosmic in scale. That conclusion changes how earlier passages are heard. Immanuel becomes part of a much larger question about God's presence with his people. The promised Davidic ruler belongs to a hope that outlives failed kings. The servant belongs to a restoration deeper than Cyrus's political liberation. Zion belongs to a future that reaches the nations. And the return from Babylon becomes one stage in a story that does not end until creation itself is described as new. This also explains why the New Testament returns to Isaiah again and again. The writers of the Gospels did not find one convenient prophecy in the book. They found a vocabulary, a world, a set of unresolved expectations, a voice in the wilderness, good news, light in darkness, Immanuel, the servant, healing, blind eyes opened, captives released, sins borne, nations receiving light, new creation. Isaiah had become one of the great landscapes through which the earliest Christians understood Jesus. Matthew quotes him, Mark echoes him. Luke places his words at crucial moments. John uses Isaiah to interpret belief and unbelief. Acts carries Isaiah into the expansion of the gospel. Paul returns to Isaiah when discussing Israel, the nations, proclamation, and hope. And the book of Revelation will eventually use imagery that sounds astonishingly familiar to anyone who has reached Isaiah's final chapters. But that creates one final question. When the New Testament uses Isaiah, is it simply collecting predictions and matching them to later events, or is something larger happening? To answer that, we have to follow Isaiah beyond his own historical lifetime and watch how his words were received inside the rest of Scripture. We have to distinguish direct quotation from broader echo, immediate historical context from later fulfillment, Davidic expectation from servant imagery, Israel's story from the mission to the nations. And we have to see why the book that began with Jerusalem under judgment became one of the primary prophetic voices used to explain the story of Jesus. Isaiah's own prophetic journey has reached new creation, but the history of his words is not finished. Isaiah's own vision has reached its horizon. New heavens, new earth, a renewed Jerusalem, the nations gathered, worship restored, judgment answered. But the story of Isaiah's words did not end when the prophet disappeared from the biblical narrative. Centuries passed. Assyria declined. Babylon rose. Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed. Judah went into exile. Then Babylon itself fell before Persia. Cyrus allowed exiles to return. The temple was rebuilt. Jerusalem lived again. Many of the events Isaiah had placed on the horizon became history. Yet something remained unresolved. The people had returned to the land, but the world Isaiah described had not fully arrived. Nations were not yet streaming together into universal peace. War had not disappeared. Justice did not define every kingdom. Israel's sins had not vanished. The glory of new creation was still ahead. The return from Babylon had been real. But Isaiah's own language had made it impossible to believe that geographical return alone exhausted the promise. The prophet had seen farther. That unfinished expectation helps explain why when the New Testament opens, Isaiah's words appear almost immediately. A voice cries in the wilderness. The language comes from Isaiah 40. Prepare the way of the Lord. In Isaiah, those words announce the coming of God to comfort and restore his people after judgment. In the Gospels, the words are applied to John the Baptist. John appears in the wilderness calling Israel to repentance and preparing the way for Jesus. The old language of return has been activated again. Another exodus is in view. Another restoration is beginning. And once again the problem is deeper than political occupation. Rome may control Judea, but removing Rome would not remove sin. The same distinction Isaiah had gradually revealed now becomes central. A people can need national deliverance and still need something deeper. Matthew reaches back to Isaiah repeatedly. One of the most famous examples comes from the sign given during the reign of Ahaz Immanuel. The original words had entered history while the house of David was threatened by enemies, and Ahaz struggled with the question of trust. Matthew takes that language and applies it to the birth of Jesus, God with us. The connection does not require us to erase Ahaz from Isaiah 7. Quite the opposite. Understanding Ahaz makes Matthew's use of Isaiah richer. The house of David once faced apparent collapse. A sign concerning God's presence stood in the middle of that crisis. Centuries later, Matthew presents Jesus as the one in whom that Immanuel theme reaches a profound fulfillment. The same gospel later reaches into another section of Isaiah when Jesus' ministry begins in Galilee. Zebulun, Naphtali. The region once associated with humiliation under foreign invasion. Isaiah had spoken of people walking in darkness, seeing a great light. Matthew uses those words as Jesus begins proclaiming the kingdom. Again, the historical layer matters. Isaiah had spoken hope into territory wounded by imperial conquest. Matthew sees the ancient image of light appearing in darkness, taking on renewed meaning in the ministry of Jesus. This is how Isaiah functions throughout much of the New Testament, not as a random collection of predictions detached from history, but as a prophetic world whose patterns, promises, images, and unresolved expectations converge around Jesus. The Gospel of Luke makes that connection explicit in another way. Jesus enters the synagogue at Nazareth. He is given the scroll of Isaiah. He reads words associated with Isaiah 61. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Good news to the poor, liberty to captives, sight for the blind," in Luke's presentation, freedom for the oppressed, the year of the Lord's favor. Then Jesus declares that the scripture has been fulfilled in their hearing. Think about the distance the words have traveled. Isaiah had spoken into a world of exile and restoration. He had envisioned Zion rebuilt, mourners comforted, captives released, broken lives restored. Now Luke presents Jesus taking that restoration vocabulary upon his own mission, but Isaiah's influence goes deeper still. One of the most important themes in the Gospels is something Isaiah knew painfully well people can see and still fail to perceive. They can hear and still fail to understand. Isaiah had encountered this problem in his own calling. His commission warned that the people's resistance would become part of the story. The New Testament returns to that language when explaining why the appearance of Jesus did not produce universal belief. John's Gospel directly quotes Isaiah's vision and his language of hardened perception. The prophet who once saw the Lord's glory in the temple becomes part of John's explanation of the response to Jesus. The connection between Isaiah and the New Testament is therefore not only about comforting messianic promises, it also includes judgment, unbelief, blindness, decision. The same tension remains. Light has come. Not everyone welcomes it. Then there is the servant. No section of Isaiah became more important to early Christian reflection on the suffering of Jesus than Isaiah 52 and 53. But once again, the New Testament itself makes the connection. Acts tells the story of an Ethiopian official traveling from Jerusalem. He is reading Isaiah. The passage concerns the one led like a sheep to slaughter, silent before the one who shears him. The official asks Philip a direct question. Who is the prophet speaking about, himself, someone else? Acts says Philip begins with that scripture and tells him the good news about Jesus. The connection is not something Christians added centuries later simply because the imagery seemed useful. It is already present inside the earliest Christian texts. 1 Peter also draws heavily from Isaiah's servant language. Christ suffers. He does not retaliate. He bears sins. His wounds become connected with healing. Peter's language follows Isaiah so closely that the servant passage becomes part of the theological vocabulary through which the early church explains the cross. The irony is extraordinary. Isaiah had spent his ministry watching rulers compete for power. Assyrian kings conquered through overwhelming force. Ahaz survived through political dependence. Babylon accumulated treasures. Human empires established control through violence. But the figure who becomes central to Christian interpretation of Isaiah does not conquer by repeating the empire's methods. He suffers. He bears, he is rejected, and through apparent defeat comes vindication. The pattern of the servant overturns ordinary definitions of power. That helps explain another important feature of Isaiah's legacy: the nations. Long before the New Testament church expanded through the Roman world, Isaiah had repeatedly imagined God's saving purpose extending beyond Israel. The nations would come to Zion. A servant would bring justice to them. The servant would become a light to the nations. Salvation would reach toward the ends of the earth. God's house would be called a house of prayer for all peoples. The final chapters would speak of nations seeing divine glory. Acts uses that Isaianic language as the gospel moves outward. Paul and Barnabas quote the call to be a light to the nations in connection with their mission. The words that once belonged inside Isaiah's restoration horizon become part of the church's understanding of why the message about Israel's Messiah is moving beyond Israel. This does not mean Israel is simply forgotten. Paul's letter to the Romans proves how impossible that conclusion would be. Romans returns to Isaiah repeatedly, precisely while wrestling with Israel, the nation's unbelief, mercy, remnant, and salvation. And there is the word again, remnant. One of Isaiah's oldest themes. One of his sons had carried it through the streets of Jerusalem. Shir Yashub, a remnant shall return. For Isaiah, judgment did not mean total erasure. Paul takes up remnant language when discussing Israel. The concept that survived Assyria exile and national catastrophe continues to shape New Testament reflection. God's purposes cannot be measured only by immediate appearances. That was true when Samaria fell. It was true when Jerusalem faced Sennacherib. It was true during exile. And Paul argues from that same theological pattern in his own discussion. This is one reason Isaiah became so important to early Christians. His book had spent centuries training readers to recognize a particular kind of story. Judgment can be real without being final. A remnant can preserve hope. A king can fail without canceling the Davidic promise. Exile can happen without God abandoning his purpose. A servant can suffer without being defeated. The nations can enter the promise without making Israel's story meaningless. And apparent endings can become beginnings. But perhaps the largest New Testament echo comes at the end. Isaiah had looked beyond restored Jerusalem, beyond political stability, beyond national return. He had seen new heavens and a new earth. The New Testament takes up that hope. 2 Peter speaks of waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Revelation reaches its closing vision and announces a new heaven and a new earth. A holy city appears. Death and mourning are overcome. God dwells with his people. The scale is cosmic. The last biblical book, therefore, ends in a world Isaiah had already taught readers to imagine. Not because every detail is identical, and not because Isaiah gave a technical blueprint of Revelation centuries in advance, but because the prophetic hope has become part of the Bible's larger vocabulary of restoration. Creation itself must be made new. This allows us finally to see the complete movement of Isaiah. It began with a city Isaiah could barely praise. Jerusalem was full of religion and full of contradiction. The prophet called heaven and earth as witnesses. The people knew worship, but tolerated injustice. Their rulers failed. Their confidence moved toward political powers. Isaiah entered the temple and saw the Lord. Holy, holy, holy. That vision changed the scale of everything that followed. Kings were no longer ultimate. Empires were no longer ultimate. Even Jerusalem was not ultimate. The throne belonged to God. From there came judgment. Isaiah warned that rebellion had consequences. The northern kingdom fell. Assyria swept through the region. Judah nearly collapsed. But judgment contained a strange sign of survival. The remnant. A stump. A seed. Something remained. Then came the crisis of trust. Ahaz looked at armies and chose Assyria. Hezekiah later faced the empire his father's policy had embraced. One king refused the offered sign. Another spread the enemy's letter before God. Both stories ask the same question: where does security finally come from? Then the prophetic horizon moved to Babylon. Jerusalem's miraculous survival from Assyria did not make Judah invulnerable. The deeper failures remained. Babylon would eventually take what Assyria had not: treasures, royal descendants, the city itself. But Babylon also failed to become the final word. Cyrus appeared, the road home opened, exiles returned, and still the story was not complete. Because Isaiah had uncovered a problem no army could solve: sin. A conqueror could free prisoners from Babylon, he could not free the human heart from rebellion. That is where the servant moved into the center. Rejected, wounded, bearing what belonged to others, then vindicated. Through the servant, restoration went deeper than geography. And from there, the vision expanded again. Zion, the poor, the broken-hearted, the outcast, the foreigner, the nations, universal worship, new creation. What began as the story of one prophet confronting one kingdom became a vision reaching the ends of the earth. That is Isaiah's untold story, not a secret hidden by history, not a collection of forbidden prophecies, not a code predicting every modern war or political leader. The hidden layer is much closer to the text than that. It is the architecture of the book itself. The famous passages belong together. Immanuel does not stand alone. The Prince of Peace does not stand alone. The suffering servant does not stand alone. Comfort, comfort my people does not stand alone. The voice in the wilderness does not stand alone. The good news to the poor does not stand alone. New heavens and new earth do not stand alone. They belong to one long movement through holiness, rebellion, judgment, trust, exile, atonement, restoration, and hope. And once those pieces are placed together, Isaiah looks very different. His central message was not, "Nothing terrible will happen to God's people." Terrible things did happen. Nor was his message, "Jerusalem cannot fall." Isaiah announced that Babylon would eventually empty its treasures. Nor was it, "A righteous human king will solve everything." Even Hezekiah could not carry that weight. Nor was it simply, "Return from exile and the story is finished." The final chapters prove otherwise. Isaiah's hope survived precisely because it was larger than all those things. The kingdom could fall. The promise could continue. The people could be scattered. God could gather. The city could become ruins. Zion could rise again. Sin could bring judgment. The servant could bear iniquity. Nations once associated with threat could become part of a horizon of worship. Creation scarred by violence could be imagined anew. And this brings us back to Isaiah himself. We know much less about his private life than a modern biography would want. Scripture does not tell us everything about his childhood. It does not provide long descriptions of his personality. It does not even narrate his death. Later tradition became associated with a violent death for Isaiah, and Hebrews speaks of faithful people who were sawn in two. But the biblical text does not explicitly identify Isaiah as that victim. So we should not pretend certainty where Scripture does not give it. The final biblical image of Isaiah is therefore not a detailed death scene. It is his voice. A voice that outlived the kings he confronted. Uzziah died, Ahaz died, Hezekiah died, Sennacherib died. Assyria eventually lost its empire. Babylon eventually lost its empire. Persia eventually lost its empire. But Isaiah's words continued to be read. They were copied, remembered, debated, prayed, quoted. And centuries later, people living under yet another empire, Rome, opened Isaiah's scroll and asked what his promises meant. That may be the final irony of his story. Isaiah spent his life teaching Judah not to confuse empire with permanence. History proved the point again and again. The empires changed. The prophetic questions remained. What do we trust when visible power appears unstoppable? Can worship mean anything when separated from justice? What happens when people receive mercy yet repeat the failures that brought judgment? Can restoration go deeper than political change? Can guilt be dealt with rather than merely postponed? Can peace extend beyond one kingdom? Can a broken creation itself be renewed? Isaiah does not answer those questions with one isolated prophecy. He answers them through an entire prophetic journey. The Holy One judges. The Holy One saves. The Holy One refuses to call evil good. The Holy One refuses to surrender his purpose to human failure. That balance is what gives Isaiah his power. Remove judgment and restoration becomes cheap. Remove restoration and judgment becomes the end of the story. Isaiah refuses both reductions. Judgment is real. So is mercy. Human failure is devastating, but it is not sovereign. And perhaps that is why the image of the stump is such an appropriate symbol for the entire book. A tree is cut down. From the outside, it appears finished. But beneath the ruined surface, life remains. A shoot emerges. Something new begins from what looked dead. Isaiah watched that pattern repeat at every level of his vision. A failing dynasty, a surviving promise, a conquered people, a remnant, a ruined city, a restored Zion, a suffering servant, vindication. An old creation marked by violence, a new creation marked by peace. The darkness was real. Isaiah never denied it. But it was not the end, and that may be the most important thing the prophet ever taught the generations who came after him. If this journey changed the way you understand Isaiah, tell us in the comments which overlooked biblical figure book or prophetic story you want explored next. Subscribe to continue the Untold Bible stories, where we follow the connections that are often lost when Scripture is read only as isolated moments. And continue with the next documentary, because the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile will show what happened when Isaiah's darkest warning finally became history. Judgment was real. Exile was coming. But beyond the ruins, Isaiah saw restoration, and beyond restoration, a world made new.